Welcome everyone to this Monash Cybersecurity Seminar. So today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Shweta Agrawal, who is an associate professor at the Computer Science and Engineering Department at Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. She earned her PhD degree at the University of Texas at Austin and did her postdoctoral work at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her area of research is in cryptography and information security, with a particular focus on post-quantum cryptography. And she has won multiple awards, such as the prestigious National Swarna Jayanti Award and a Best Paper Award at a leading crypto conference, in particular Eurocrypt. So today she will be talking about optimal broadcast encryption from Pairings and LWE. Thank you very much, Shweta. The scene is yours.
Thank you for inviting me. Let me get started with the talk. As usual, feel free to stop and interrupt me if there are any questions or comments along the way. All right, so today I'm going to talk about optimal broadcast encryption from Pairings and LWE. And this is joint work with Shweta Yamada, which appeared at Eurocrypt 2020. So let me start by introducing the problem of broadcast encryption. Here we have a sender who wants to send an encrypted message to some set of users, but she only has access to a broadcast channel. So this means that when she encrypts her message and sends it across, this message reaches everybody, all the users in the system. And what she would like is that only the legitimate or authenticated users, authorized users, manage to decrypt and read the message. So in this example, for instance, she would like the first 3 users to be able to read the message and the rest of them not to be able to read it. So this property should hold even if the unauthorized users pull together their keys and try to open the message. And this property is known as collusion resistance. So it's obvious to see that the problem has a trivial solution if you just use public key encryption. For instance, you can assume that all the users in the system have a public and secret key, and the sender can encrypt the message to each one of the authorized users using their public keys. And then, of course, the security property that we talked about will be achieved easily. But then the problem with this approach is that it leads to a very, very large ciphertext, in particular one that scales with the number of users in the system, which is undesirable. You could think of like a television broadcast or something. You could have millions of users and you don't want to encrypt for each one of them. So the question of broadcast encryption is whether you can achieve this property with shorter ciphertext. And there's been some very nice prior work in this area. So in particular, this work by Bonnet, and Waters in 2005 showed that you could actually use pairings and achieve a very short ciphertext, like just a constant number of group elements. And also the secret key of the users can be very short, but then the public key of the system is very large. So in particular, the public key scales with the number of users in the system, which is obviously undesirable. And in the same work, they showed that you can trade off the size of the public key with the ciphertext. So in particular, you could have each of these components scaling with the square root of the number of users, and you could still achieve this security property that you'd like. And subsequently, there were many follow-up works that achieve other nice properties of broadcast encryption, like some make it identity-based, some achieve anonymity, some achieve adaptive security, and so on. But nobody manages to improve the public key size, even from strong assumptions like indistinguishability obfuscation. So this state of affairs continued for a while and is obviously dissatisfying. Now in 2014, there was a sort of a significant step forward with the work of Bonnet, Waters, and Zandri, which showed that actually you could achieve, optimal size parameters. By optimal size here, I mean that the public key, ciphertext, and secret key all can be constant size. here when I say constant size, I'm obviously hiding, factors in the security parameter. So we're just going to ignore those. But they show that you can do this if you assume multilinear maps of degree log n, where n again is the number of users. So this is great because, we didn't even know how to do it from IO, and now at least there's some solution, even if relying on a strong assumption. And even if we don't know how to instantiate these multilinear maps, but at least there's some solution. In our work, we showed how to get the same result by using only bilinear maps and LWE. But our proof is in the generic group model. So we'll see details about this, in later parts of the talk. But it's not a 100% satisfactory solution. So we improve the assumptions quite a lot. Only bilinear maps in LWE, but the proof is not in the standard model. And then in another follow-up work with Shweta Yamada and Daniel Wicks, we improve this further. We take it to the standard model, but it's still not fully satisfactory because the proof now relies on knowledge assumptions, which also we'll talk about in the rest of the talk. And getting it from completely standard assumptions in the standard model, this is still open as far as I know. So our work proceeds via a connection to attribute-based encryption. So let me start by defining that. Attribute-based encryption is a really cool primitive that allows you to do access control on encrypted data. So here the idea is that you have a bunch of users in the system, and each of them have some secret keys, and you have some encrypted files on some server, let's say. Now, what we have here is that the secret keys of the users correspond to some attributes that they might possess. For instance, things like the role that they are in, the department that they're affiliated with, the university or organization, date of joining, and so on. And we have that the files, the encrypted files, are all locked with respect to some kind of policy. So we think of this as an access control policy. So for instance, the first file might say that, well, the user who decrypts, the only users who should be able to decrypt are those that are affiliated with IIT Madras, they are professors and in the computer science department, and they've joined after a particular date, right? And in which case, if the user has secret keys that match these attributes, so if she is a professor in computer science at IIT Madras, having joined after a certain date, then she should be able to decrypt the file, and so on and so forth, right? And we want collusion resistance, right? So we'd like that if two users put together their keys, they can still only decrypt those files that they are individually authorized to decrypt. In particular, they should not be able to decrypt any file that one of them was not authorized to decrypt. And this property, just as in broadcast encryption, is called collusion resistance. So collusion resistance is a fairly common property in, all, if not most, if not all, cryptographic protocols, which is just that, well, dishonest players getting together should not have any advantage. So, all right, in the context of ABE, we have two variants. So first is the ciphertext policy variant, which is the kind of system we've seen so far. Here, the ciphertext embeds an access control policy inside it, and the keys are associated with attributes. You could also flip this around. So you could think of a key policy ABE, and indeed these are more popular, at least in terms of constructions. So now you can have a policy embedded in the secret key and attributes embedded in the ciphertext, and the same conditions, the same condition holds for decryption. So let's try to construct broadcast encryption via this connection to attribute-based encryption, and we're going to follow 3 broad steps in this construction. So first, we're going to argue that ciphertext policy ABE with certain efficiency properties implies broadcast encryption. Then we'll show how LWE can be used to construct ciphertext policy ABE which satisfies the efficiency properties but is unfortunately not secure against collusions. So step 2 is going to give us something which works in terms of functionality but does not satisfy our main security property, which is collusion resistance. And step 3 is the main innovation of this work, which is how to use pairings in order to add collusion resistance to this recipe that we have so far. So before I go on, I'd just like to quickly touch upon some perspective on this problem. So steps 1 and 2 are, they were kind of folklore. A lot of researchers that even I'm aware of observed this already, that, ciphertext policy ABE with some properties does imply broadcast encryption, and that LWE does give this without the requisite security. The main hurdle that led to this problem being open for so long is step 3, how to add collusion resistance. And using pairings in order to achieve step 3 is the main technical innovation in this work. And it was inspired by recent constructions of IO that also combine LWE and pairings. So the details of how we use LWE and pairings together is very different from these IO constructions, but the philosophy is similar. We'll see more about that. All right, so let's proceed to see how we put these ideas together. So first, let's look at how to express broadcast encryption as ciphertext policy ABE. And this is not very hard to see. Like, I can think of every user in the system as being associated with some index, some user index, and let me just think of that as the attribute. Okay, so the user's attribute is just his or her index in the system. The policy in the ciphertext is also not very hard to imagine. So we can just think of the function as sort of hardwiring all the legitimate users in the system. So this F sub S, where S is the set of authorized users, this set S is just hardwired into this function. And given a user index as input, the function will simply check whether the user belongs to the set or not. If yes, then it outputs 1. If not, it outputs 0. So fairly natural, right? And this is what the circuit is going to look like. So let's observe a few things about this circuit. So this circuit has short input, right? So the input length is just log n bits because it's just the user index, which obviously can fit into log n bits. And it's also shallow depth, right? So because I just need to kind of compare with the members of this set, it's easy to see that this will be low depth, log n depth. But the width of this function is wide. So, I mean, I do need to kind of check every possible user. And there are in general order n authorized users. So this is a wide width function. And the observation that we can take from this is that if you had CPABE with parameters that did not depend on the width of the function, then this actually is enough for optimal broadcast encryption, right? So we've just seen how to capture broadcast encryption as a CPABE functionality. And we've observed that the input length and depth of this function is not bad at all. So it's sufficient for optimal parameters. But the width is really bad. So if our solution for the CPABE in any way grows linearly with the width of the circuit, then, again, we're going to end up with order n in some of the parameters, and that will be bad. So this is the observation. And now one might hope that you could like try to design CPABE from LWE, but it turns out this itself is a central open question, even without this question, even without this constraint of width independence. So we just don't know how to do this. But let's keep looking. So what else do we know from LWE? So we know that the dual of CPABE, which is KPABE, the key policy variant, this does exist from LWE, and in fact it's powerful enough to support all of P. We only needed NC1, and moreover all the parameters are actually width independent here. So this looks promising. So what we'll try to do is we'll try to take this construction and we'll try to modify it somehow into a CPAB. We'll see where we get stuck, and we'll try to use pairings to overcome that issue, right? So before we proceed with that, let's just pay particular attention to the parameters that these constructions achieve. So here let's think of the function of this system being some f with input length L, depth D, and width W. Then the KPABE constructions achieve all parameters as polynomial in the security parameter, the length, the input length, and the depth. And in fact, the secret key is not even dependent on the input length. So it's sort of even better. It wouldn't even hurt us if it did depend on the input length, but it doesn't even depend on that. It depends only on the depth. And in particular, none of these parameters depend on the width. So that's good news for us. So let's see if we could somehow construct a CPABE from this KPABE, since it satisfies our efficiency properties. And here we'll observe some very useful structure that this construction has, which is called decomposability. So this construction is by Bonnet et al. And what decomposability means is that the encryption algorithm, which takes as input some attribute set X and some message, can be divided into the following two steps. So first you generate encodings, CI comma B, where I ranges from 1 to L and B is a bit 0 and 1. So the encryption algorithm is going to generate encodings for every possible position, every possible bit. Okay, so it will generate 2L encodings. And then what it will do is that when it receives the attribute X, it will simply select the encodings that correspond to the values of the bits xi. Okay, so I hope that this is clear. The idea is that you could think of it as generating all possible encodings without knowing X, right? Think of it as being arranged in a matrix with the top row corresponding to all zeros and the bottom row corresponding to all ones. And then when you know the particular attribute string that you're interested in, you just look at xi. If it's 0, you choose the top, the ith entry in the top row. If it's 1, you choose from the bottom row. And you just put these together, and this is your ciphertext. This is what you output. So the first attempt that we might have at constructing a CPABE is the following. So now I want to encrypt against a circuit, right? Not against an attribute. So what can I do? Well, maybe what I'll do is I'll just generate a fresh instance of the KPABE scheme. And I know how to embed the function f into the secret key. So I'll give you a secret key corresponding to f. And I'll give you ciphertext for basically all possible values of X. So because of the decomposability, this does not mean 2 to the L possible values. This just means 2 times L possible values, right? So I'll just give you the secret key, the public key, and let's say all possible encodings. Now, as you can imagine, this is not going to be secure. So, if I give you both encodings for a particular column, then this is insecure. So let's try to use a trick that was introduced by Sahai and Sealiglu. So the idea here is that instead of giving you these encodings in the clear, I'm going to simply put them in boxes, right? So I'm going to encrypt them with different public keys. I'll have as many public keys as encodings, and I'll just encrypt each encoding with its corresponding public key. Now, the secret key for a given attribute vector X can just be the corresponding secret keys for that X, right? So again, it's sort of similar to the idea before, except that now we've thrown one layer of encryption on top, right? So now if I give you secret keys corresponding to the all zeros vector, then obviously what I'll be able to decrypt is just the encodings of the top row. And this will correspond to the encodings for the all zeros vector. And then I can, rely on my underlying KPABE scheme to use the ciphertext along with the secret key, decrypt it, and get the message as desired. So this seems to take us a little further, right? So I already said this. I'll just recover the encodings corresponding to the X that I want, and then I'll run the VGG plus decryption. But it's again easy to see that this is not going to work for us all the way, because if I have even two users that collude, let's say the user with the all zeros string and the user with the all one string, then obviously, they have all possible secret keys now, and the same decomposability that was helping us will now harm us, because now they can recover all possible encodings, and again, all bets are off. Are there any questions so far?
Shweta, I have one question, which is probably a little bit kind of more general than the details that you mentioned here. It mainly relates to the first step in which you constructed a BE from
CPABE.
From a CPABE. So are there other constructions from weaker or stronger functional encryptions rather than IO? Like, for example, make the ABE, I don't know, an inner product encryption, a non-zero inner product encryption. Can a broadcast encryption be constructed from there, or even stronger ones?
So I think that from functional encryption, certainly you could construct broadcast encryption.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
but from weaker ones, like
from weaker ones, to the best of my knowledge, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head of any weaker thing that would imply broadcast encryption. It seems so. Broadcast encryption is really an ABE kind of primitive, because the only thing you're trying to hide is a single message bit. So
yeah.
in some sense, something like functional encryption seems like too heavy a tool for something like broadcast encryption, because
Yes.
in functional encryption, like especially if you followed all the recent work that we have on constructions, the whole issue ends up being that you need to hide this this attribute vector X, and then there's this use of FHE, but then there's leakage on the FHE noise, so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
something like broadcast encryption seems inherently simpler than that, because we're trying to hide very little. We're just trying to hide a bit.
Yes.
But
Yes.
that said,
That's my point.
yeah. So you're right that it seems simpler, but it's simpler in the sense of it's like an ABE. So I'm just talking at a high level intuitive
Yes.
level, right? Because there's no formal equivalence here, but
Yeah.
the weaker primitives that we have within the realm of functional encryption, like inner product encryption and so on, or quadratic functional encryption and so on, these are really focused on hiding the whole attribute vector and not a single bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in some sense, the all the work done in that space is in some sense orthogonal to what we need here. I'm not saying that some kind of connection is not possible. Maybe there is something, I haven't really thought about it. But,
Yeah.
just my first response to it is that it is a weakening of functional encryption, but the weakening is in the sense that we don't need to hide this X.
Yeah.
It's in my mind, it's less about weakening the functionality. It's more about weakening the security.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Are there any other questions? So I hope that so far what we've done is clear. We're taking this key policy system and we're trying to fit it into the ciphertext policy framework, right? And the way we do it is that the encryptor now is given this function f and is going to just sample a fresh instance of the key policy system, encrypt for all possible attributes, because the encryptor now only has the function, it does not have X. So it will encrypt for all possible attributes. It will give the secret key for F. And in order to prevent trivial security attacks, it will at least encrypt sort of these ciphertexts themselves. So there's one layer of PKE that we're adding on top of the KPABE scheme here, right? And given the X, we're going to decrypt the appropriate encodings, and then we'll use the functionality of the underlying system to get what we want. Is this idea clear?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, so yeah, so as I was saying, it's obvious that the collusion of even just two users will completely break security. So the third step is how to make this collusion resistant, right? And as I said, this was the main technical innovation in this work. So what we're going to do is, instead of using PKE to encrypt each LWE encoding, we're somehow going to use pairings in a more powerful way. And let me remind you what pairings are before I go further. So pairings, a pairing is a bilinear map E that takes G1 cross G2 to some target group GT. Here G1 and G2 are finite groups. We call them source groups. And E of G1 to the A, G2 to the B is equal to E of G1, G2 to the AB. So this is the bilinearity property that we have. And the first idea that we had was, clearly if we provide these ciphertext encodings in the clear, there's an attack. So can we maybe provide all of these in the exponent? So let's see how to do that. So before I go forward, I'm going to remind everyone of the bracket notation that we use for pairings. So here the idea is that you just write the exponent in square brackets, and the subscript denotes the group in which you live. So let's see, if we try to put these LWE encodings in the exponent of these groups, then what can we do? So in particular, the whole reason we're even talking about any of this is to prevent collusion attacks. So let's see if we can make any progress there. So here we'll rely upon a standard trick in pairings, which is to randomize the keys for any user with a particular user-specific randomness. Let's call it delta U. So we're going to set up our scheme so that the decryptor recovers the encodings in the exponent corresponding to the particular attribute vector X. But all of these encodings for a particular attribute vector X are going to be masked with a user specific randomness delta U. Okay, so if I now have two separate users that have two separate attributes X and X prime, then the encodings that the decryptor recovers are going to have masking factors delta U and delta U prime. So the attacker cannot just mix and match encodings the way it was doing previously. Then having said that, let's say that we can somehow hope to prevent collusion attacks like that. Of course, we'll see it in more detail further on. But this seems like an idea that will help us to prevent users from mixing and matching their keys, right? So then the second question that we need to deal with is that, fine, so now I'm going to, give you these encodings in the exponent somehow. But I need to ensure that a given user or a given attribute is only able to recover one of two possible encodings, right? Because again, if they recover both encodings masked even with the same thing, the same delta U, this is a problem. Because if you remember previously, I told you that, given both encodings in a given column, there's in fact a linear attack that lets the attacker recover the secret. So even if we've put things in the exponent, if they are masked with the same randomness, then the user can still conduct this linear attack and possibly do bad things. So our idea to force the user to select exactly one out of two encodings is to introduce some position-wise randomness and use the pairing operation to cancel one of the two random terms per column. So this is how I'm going to do it concretely. So remember the trick of using 2L public keys, right? So we're going to do something similar, but now we have these masking terms WIB in the exponent. So these, you can think of them as a public key, but they're a very special type of public key. So this is our master public key. And our ciphertext is going to have the CIBs in the exponent, each masked with the corresponding WIB. So you can see that this is easy to do because the CIB I can compute in the clear and I can raise the public key to that encoding to get exactly what I've written down here, which is WIB times CIB in the exponent. Okay, so now here is the idea for selecting exactly one out of two. The secret key for a given attribute vector X is going to contain the cancellation of the WIB for that corresponding X. So you can think of this again as containing the secret key for the particular bits of X, right? In the previous solution that we saw, where we said that we'll give the secret keys matching a given attribute vector X. We're doing something similar, but we're working with some very particular algebraic structure over here. So these secret keys I can think of as the WIBs in the clear, right? Where the public key is G to the WIB. Now I'm going to cancel out the WIXI for the ith bit. Okay, and this delta is a new randomness, the user specific randomness that I talked about in the previous slide that I'm going to add. So my secret key looks like delta to the delta divided by WIXI in the exponent. So now what's going to happen is that I can pair the corresponding, secret key elements with the corresponding ciphertext elements to cancel out the WIXI, right, and obtain delta CIXI, which is what I wanted, as I showed you in the previous slide. And clearly, if I try to match this delta divide by WIXI with the wrong ciphertext component, then this WIB will not get cancelled. You'll get some funny fraction which will not let you proceed with the computation. So this is the idea of selecting exactly 1 out of 2 encodings. So far, what did we do? So we randomized our LWE encodings by putting them in the exponent and masking them with some user-specific scaler. This is a standard trick for collusion resistance in the world of pairings. Then we showed a way to, select 1 out of 2 encodings. This is, in hindsight, not very surprising because, selecting 1 out of 2, this is like the multiplex operation. This is a quadratic operation, and it's not very surprising that using pairings, you can somehow implement it. Right? So the way in which we implemented it is kind of particularly simple, but you could actually think of other ways also, just using quadratic operations of selecting 1 out of 2 inputs. So this is also not terribly surprising. The big question that remains is, ultimately I have to test whether a given user index lives in a set. And this is an operation which is in NC1. We saw that circuit, right? So we discussed how this circuit has short depth, but it's still NC1, so it's still logarithmic. And moreover, X is encoded using LWE and it's sitting in the exponent. So fine, I mean, I managed to get rid of collusion attacks by this randomness, and I managed to find a way to, only enable the decryptor to select 1 out of 2 encodings. But now, even if I end up with this, delta Ci Xi in the exponent, it's not at all clear how we're going to proceed beyond this, because obviously I want to actually do this set membership testing. And pairings can only compute quadratic polynomials, right? Whereas the membership testing is in NC1. So why should this be possible? And this is sort of the really cool serendipity that happens. The structure of this evaluation algorithm in this KPABE scheme, the evaluation algorithm being the algorithm that checks whether, a given X is in the set. So given, or I should say that the evaluation algorithm that takes ciphertext encodings and computes some circuit on them. This algorithm is actually linear in the secret inputs. And therefore it is compatible with pairings. Now here you might be surprised that, I'm evaluating an NC1 circuit on encodings and I'm telling you that the circuit is linear. So the circuit is not linear in totality. The cool thing is that it has non-linear components, but those non-linear steps can be performed downstairs. They don't have to be performed in the exponent. So that is the sort of nice coincidence that allows this approach to work, that I can perform non-linear operations not in the exponent, so sort of downstairs, right? And I can perform some linear operations in the exponent. And in the end, I'm still going to end up with evaluating this NC1 circuit in the exponent. So let me try to explain this in a little more detail. So this is what the structure of the decryption algorithm looks in the ABE scheme that we're working with. So what this decryption does is that in order to evaluate any function f, even if this function is deep, like in NC1, there's a linear function that we evaluate on the encodings, which is going to give us, the message plus some noise. Okay, and then we're going to remove the noise using standard rounding techniques in order to recover the message. So now in the exponent, what I can do is I can compute this linear function on these encodings. I can do it while they are in the exponent to get delta times, scaled message plus noise. And I now ended up with this, delta times scaled message plus noise in the exponent. And now my hope is to somehow remove this noise and recover the message. So here we run into another roadblock because this delta is huge. It's a random element, so it's not small by any means. So how am I going to manage to recover this message, right? So what we do is we let the decryptor to learn not just delta times the message plus noise, but we also provide the decryptor with delta in the exponent of the target group. So if the noise is polynomially small, then you can just do a brute force search. Like you can just take this delta and just keep raising it to successively increasing powers and check if you, hit the first element that you received. And this is possible if your noise is bounded polynomially. Suppose your noise can be bounded by a polynomial value, let's say some bound b. Then what can I do if my message bit is 0? Then I can just raise delta to the second component to 1, 2, 3, 4 up to b, and check if it matches the first component that I received, right? And I can similarly raise it to, well, uh, q over 2 plus 1, q over 2 plus 2, and so on up to b, and again check if it matches. So I can recover the message bit if this noise can be bounded. And obviously then the question is, can we bound it to be polynomially small? And it turns out here that there's another happy coincidence. So it turns out that these ciphertext evaluation algorithms enjoy what's called an asymmetric noise growth property. If you've not seen it, then it doesn't matter for the purposes of this talk what it is. It just suffices to say that using this nice property, you can bound the noise to be polynomial for NC1 circuits. So we don't know how to go beyond NC1 for this, but we do know how to support NC1, and that turns out to suffice for broadcast encryption. So this is the overview of the construction. Are there any questions about how the construction works?
I do have a question. I guess it's a bit technical, but so you mentioned that for the indices that do not match, there will be no information leaked. Is this easy to kind of prove, or is this one of the difficult parts?
It's actually coming up in the slide after this one. So
okay.
that's something that we can only show in the generic group model.
Okay.
Right, and I mean, in subsequent work, like I mentioned, we can show it based on knowledge assumptions, but that is one of the technical hurdles that we'll face in the proof. So let's in the last 5 minutes that we have left, let me just try to give you a intuition about the security proof. So let's begin first with recollecting the generic group model. The generic group model basically says that the adversary can only perform legitimate group operations. So she can just take pairings, do linear combinations, and test if she gets 0 at the end of this. And the property that this model gives you is that if you don't get 0, then basically you learn nothing. So you did a bunch of things that are sitting in the exponent, you end up with something which is also in the exponent. If this thing is not 0, or more generally, if this output is not small, then you did not really learn anything about it. This is the idea of the generic group model. So now let's see how to leverage this in our security proof. Okay, so let's start by looking at what the adversary sees. So she sees the challenge ciphertext, which looks like something like this, right? And of course, she sees the, in this, she sees the, KPABE ciphertext components, all raised to the exponent randomized with these position-wise randomness, WIB. And there is, of course, the ABE secret key and the ABE public key. And then she sees the secret keys which look like this, right? So they cancel out the position-wise randomness for the appropriate positions or the appropriate bits in those positions. And they add a user-specific randomness delta. And this randomness changes for every key query. Okay, so this is what the secret key looks like. And of course, there's also the delta itself sitting in the target group. We need this for decryption. So now what can the adversary do? According to the generic group model, well, you know, she can take pairings between these components and she can take linear combinations. So this is kind of all that she can obtain. So now let's see, you know, how we can rule out attacks. So let's look at these terms. So, you know, let's look at this left term. So this is in, you know, exactly the response to your question. So if you take a pairing between non-matching terms, then you get this WIB divided by WI prime B prime, right? So you don't get the cancellation that you would like, and you end up with these kinds of terms. And you could also have terms that just look like, you know, delta J, CI, XIJ in the target group. So now the first claim that we show is that terms of the form A, if you use them in a linear combination, then with overwhelming probability, you will not end up with 0. And this actually, it follows sort of using standard arguments. So this particular term only appears when you pair these two components, right? And any other pairing that you take will never give you this particular term. So we can argue just using the Schwarz-Zippel lemma that you cannot have different monomials cancel each other using linear combinations. So, you know, we can assume that these kinds of terms do not help in the linear combination. Now, what about these remaining terms? So here we want to say that, you know, fine. So now the adversary is forced to take only legitimate pairings, like only between matching positions, but she still gets many keys. So you still do end up with terms of the kind B here with different deltas, right? And we can also show that this does not help because, well, the deltas are all different. So if you take a linear combination with these different deltas, then you're not going to end up with a cancellation except with negligible probability. So this is also a simple application of Schwarz-Zippel, right? So yeah, this is the intuition of the proof. And since delta J is user specific randomness, this argues that collusion between different users is not useful, and we can therefore focus on the single user setting. So now in the single user setting, you know, things are not so bad because we can just use the security of the ABE scheme. So now we have these, you know, a single delta and sort of encodings corresponding to a single attribute vector X. And this, by the security of the underlying ABE scheme, can be argued as indistinguishable from random. So this is going to finish the argument that we don't learn anything about the message. Then in our follow-up work with Shweta and Daniel Wicks, we showed how to improve this result by taking it from the generic group model to the standard model. But we rely on a knowledge assumption. So there a variant of the so-called koala assumption on bilinear groups. This is, as I already mentioned, a knowledge type assumption. And it essentially says that if there's an adversary that distinguishes G to the VR from some random G to the W, then there's another adversary that can find a vector X such that XV is 0. So it's like, it's an orthogonality, a knowledge of orthogonality assumption. So, you know, the only way to differentiate between a linear subspace and truly random is to find a vector that cancels the subspace. This is the assumption. And yeah, I think I already said this. So the assumption says that if an adversary distinguishes group elements whose exponents are on some hyperplane from random group elements, then there exists another one that outputs a vector that is orthogonal to that hyperplane, right? All right. So intuitively, I already said this. It says that the only way to distinguish these group elements is to find an orthogonal vector. So to summarize, we constructed CPABE for NC1 with compact parameters from LWE and bilinear GGM. It gave us the first optimal broadcast encryption without multilinear maps. Excuse me. It also implies identity-based broadcast encryption with similar efficiency. And it raises even more questions than it solves, right? So what about the standard model? Can we improve assumptions there? What about getting new applications for these techniques? So, you know, when we first had this result, we were really excited thinking that, you know, this is doing something new and maybe there's going to be lots of applications we can think of or others can think of. But in fact, I'm not aware of any work that solves any other problem using these ideas, which to me is surprising. Like even we tried and could not really come up with anything. I'm sure there are more things lurking out there that could make use of some of these ideas, but we've still to find these. And then of course you can hope to support you know, circuit classes beyond NC1. You can hope to remove these pairings and try to just use LWE. So there are a lot of these open questions that still remain. And with these, I'll end my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shweta. This was a very interesting talk. I have a question, but I'll first ask the audience if anyone has any questions to go first. Anyone? You can also use the Q&A button if you don't want to unmute yourself. Yeah, I think I'll go ahead. So these CIBs that you mentioned, so these are kind of like scalars, right? They need to be scalars so that you can put them in the exponent.
I mean, I think they're actually vectors and you can still put them in the exponent. So, you know, in the standard way. I mean, basically you G to the A1, A2, A3 can just be G to the A1, G to the A2, G to the A3. So there are standard ways of.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, yes. I was going to ask, is that the reason why you cannot leak two encodings to the adversary? Because they are something like A times S plus E and then B times S plus E.
They're actually, okay, first thing is that they are vectors. And you cannot leak them both to the adversary because the labels are in fact correlated. So in the first case, it's going to be something like AS plus E. And in the second case, it will be AS plus GS plus E, E prime. Okay, so now if I just subtract them, then the AS goes away. And now I just have GS plus some noise. And, you know, G is a public matrix for which you have a trapdoor. So you could multiply with some vector orthogonal to G and kill that term. And then now you have something, you know, a vector in a product with noise sitting in the exponent. The vector you already know. So now you could recover the noise. So this is the issue.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Right. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I guess not. Okay. So thank you very much, Shweta, again, for the very interesting
Sure.
talk.
Thanks,
And
Alvi.
thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Yeah, hope to see you in the next seminar. Thank you.
Bye.
Mm.